Making expertise portable on the outside solves one problem and exposes another. Once Compound was working, once people could move through the thinking without direct access to us, it became impossible not to see what still hadn't changed. Internally, the same gravity still existed. Decisions still escalated. Edge cases still found their way back to the same people. Not because the team wasn't capable, and not because the system was incomplete, but because the thinking itself still lived unevenly across the organization. Some of it was explicit. Much of it was implicit, and the implicit parts mattered most. This is where most firms get stuck. Even after building something impressive for the outside world, they assume that public scale is the hard part. In reality, internal scale is harder because it forces you to confront what your organization actually knows versus what it assumes it knows. Inside Quantus, the issue wasn't confusion, it was dependence. Years of decisions, nuanced interpretations, trade-offs that were never written down because they were obvious to the people who made them. That kind of knowledge feels stable while the people who carry it are present. It becomes fragile the moment they're not. That fragility doesn't show up as failure. It shows up as interruption, as escalation, as subtle hesitation. People know what to do most of the time, but when something falls outside the obvious path, the system still reaches for the same minds. We could have responded the usual way. More documentation, more meetings, more training sessions designed to transfer knowledge, but those solutions all assume that knowledge transfers cleanly when articulated. What they miss is that the most important parts of judgment aren't rules, they're lenses. They're not answers, they're ways of seeing. And ways of seeing don't survive handoffs very well. That's when it became clear that the architecture we had built externally had to exist internally as well. Not as a mirror image, but as an institutional layer whose sole purpose was to preserve how decisions were made, not just what decisions had been made. That layer became QHub. Not a knowledge base, not a dashboard, not a place to store information. QHub was designed as institutional memory, the accumulated judgment of the firm made accessible without requiring presence of the people who formed it. This required a different kind of discipline. You can't just upload documents and call it memory. Memory is contextual. It lives in how ideas connect, how exceptions are handled, how trade-offs are weighed when the answer isn't obvious. QHub had to capture patterns of reasoning, not static conclusions. So we built it around questions, not answers. How do we think about this kind of situation? What usually matters here and what usually doesn't? What are the failure modes if this is done too early, too late, or in isolation? Those weren't rhetorical questions. They were the backbone of the system. And as we did this, forcing intuition to become explicit, something unexpected happened. The system started to reflect the thinking back to us in ways that made it legible not just internally, but externally as well. There was a moment during this phase that made that shift unmistakable. Early on, while we were still building on Emergent, I got on a call with their engineering team. At the time, the platform was still young. I assumed the call would be instructional, a chance for me to understand their tool better, maybe get guidance on how to do things the right way. The conversation went in the opposite direction. Instead of walking me through features, they started asking how I was using the platform, what kinds of systems I was trying to build, how I was structuring logic, what problems I was actually solving underneath the interface. At some point, it became clear that they weren't onboarding a user. They were studying a use case. The irony wasn't lost on me. I still had no formal coding background. I wasn't thinking like an engineer. I was thinking like a domain expert who had been forced, by necessity, to make judgment explicit. And once that judgment was explicit, it became legible, not just to the system, but to the people who built the system itself. The call ended with a request I hadn't expected. Would I be open to speaking with their investors about what was possible with their platform? That moment clarified something important. The leverage wasn't technical skill, it was clarity of thought. Once the thinking had been externalized and structured, it didn't just support the firm, it started to teach back. That realization reinforced why QHub mattered so much. This wasn't about preserving answers. It was about preserving coherence. Making sure that when people engage with complexity, they were engaging it through the same lens, even if the original lens makers weren't in the room. On top of that institutional layer, we added internal intelligence, not to make decisions, but to orient people inside the thinking. An elevated version of QGPT trained not on generic information, but on how we actually reason through trade-offs. Its role wasn't authority, it was continuity. It didn't tell the team what to do. It reminded them how to think. This distinction is critical. The moment an internal system starts acting like an oracle, it undermines judgment instead of preserving it. QHub was built to do the opposite, to reduce unnecessary escalation while reinforcing the firm's intellectual spine. Once it was in place, the change was subtle but profound. Conversation shifted. Instead of asking for answers, the team started validating assumptions. Instead of escalating uncertainty, they explored it. Edge cases became discussions instead of interruptions. The quality of judgment didn't flatten, it became more consistent. And something else happened that we didn't fully anticipate. By making the thinking explicit, we were forced to confront it ourselves. Assumptions that had lived comfortably in intuition had to survive articulation. Gaps revealed themselves. Ambiguities became visible. The system didn't just preserve judgment, it refined it. This is the paradox of institutional memory. When done correctly, it doesn't freeze thinking in place. It sharpens it. It creates a shared intellectual terrain where improvement is possible without erosion. At that point, Quantus stopped feeling like a firm that depended on a few people holding everything together. It became something more durable, less reactive, less fragile. The work still required judgment, but it no longer required constant heroics. And once you experience that internally, it changes how you see scale entirely. You stop thinking in terms of output and start thinking in terms of continuity. You realize that the true risk isn't growth, it's amnesia. The loss of hard-earned understanding as organizations expand beyond the conditions that created it. By the end of this phase, it was clear what we had built wasn't just a set of tools, it was an operating system for judgment. One that allowed expertise to compound instead of resetting, and that protected the integrity of the work as the firm evolved. In the final episode, I want to step back and look at what this became once we are living inside it. Why this pattern extends far beyond Quantus, and why Orbitify was the natural continuation of the work rather than a new direction.